Hello, and welcome to the New York State Archives webinar module series on record scheduling, a family of short presentations providing overviews of topics related to retention and disposition of government records. This module's topic is Appraising Historical Records, Local Scenarios. My name's Dennis Riley, and I will be your presenter. This installment will look at some examples and scenarios of appraising records within a local context. Hopefully, you've already watched the module that details the process of archival appraisal within the local context. We won't be going into all the details of appraisal in this one, so check that one out first. This installment highlights some examples of the process to illustrate what was covered in the other module. But to start with a very quick review, appraisal, at its most basic, is an assessment or analysis of the evidential and informational value of material. In this context, we are concerned with archival or historical value, not monetary value. Archival appraisal seeks to be an objective process insofar as we resist personal bias. In this regard, we ask certain questions about the content and context of records that might affect their enduring value. Our analysis weighs answers to these questions, prioritizing which records have the most research value and represent the essential evidence of a particular function, event, or community. We ought to make an informed decision based on our answers instead of making a seemingly capricious decision or relying on gut feeling or instinct. Within the context of New York State, records have unique and enduring value as evidence and information about the operation of government and its impact on the people of New York, as well as the people and events which shape New York history. In this sense, significance depends on the informational and evidential value of materials. Keep in mind that these notions of value are not mutually exclusive. Appraisal is based on answering certain questions, and significant depends on answering questions such as these. When the records were created, what kind of information do they contain, who created the records and why were they created, what records exist or don't exist, and what is the unique history of your government or community. The State Archives does provide a framework in the local government retention schedule. We assign permanent retention periods to certain records which have gone through the State Archives appraisal process. These are primarily records with ongoing administrative, legal, and fiscal value, or records which have historical value for all local governments. We have also added appraisal notes to some record series, about 90, advising that the series may have historical value depending on local variables and experience. For instance, Local Government Schedule Item 743 covers medical case records. You'll find a note from the State Archives that says these may have continuing value for historical or other research, even though the retention period is essentially 7 years after the death or discharge of the patient. So take a moment and think, if you can, of an instance where these records may have value in one locality, but not another. I would throw out the example of Love Canal, which might be an example of a community in need of having to retain public health records such as these. Or more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has affected communities differently. You might decide to retain patient files from 2020 permanently. However, do you just retain COVID patient records or all 2020 patient records to provide greater context? Or you might decide to only retain a representative sample to enable future researchers to understand the impact of the pandemic on the local community and the healthcare system. But the State Archives cannot know the unique circumstances of your government and your community. So the final decision must be up to the records management officer, or perhaps with advice from your local records advisory committee or your local historian. And the decision should be made through the appraisal process, allowing you to make an informed decision. And to quickly recap the questions or criteria discussed in the other module, which we can use to assess significance, these fall into 4 groups. The first one being, when were the records created? Are they old? Are the records scarce? Do the records cover a long or short period of time? Are the records from an important time period? Question 2 is, why were the records created? Which office created these records? What are the principal functions of that office? And most importantly, do the records document those primary functions? Question 3, what is actually in the records? What information do they contain? Do the records cover important activities of an office, government entity, or community? Are they non-routine? Do they contain more in-depth information on people, places, or events? Is the series a unique source of information, or the best source of the information, or the only source? Does the information in a series of records dispute other sets of records or other information? Do they provide information on a local, statewide, or national scope? Are the events unique within or beyond your local community? And do they reflect different experiences from other governments and communities in New York State? And finally, who created the records? What is the official position of the person? And was the creator personally involved in the events, or did they have the expertise necessary to understand the topics involved in the materials? And does the creator exhibit a bias or a particular point of view? Let's put these questions into action. Here's a hypothetical case of appraising library records related to public requests to remove certain books from circulation. These records are subject to local government schedule item 601, which covers library material censorship and complaint records, including evaluations by staff, patrons' complaints, and the record of any final decision. The retention period is 6 years, but the schedule includes a note to appraise these records for historical significance prior to disposition. Some library censorship records deal with serious constitutional issues and may have value for future research. So let's try to answer some of our appraisal questions. In terms of when the records were created, is this series old? It dates from 1990 to 2005, so it's not particularly old, but it does span 15 years. We may want to explore whether this is an important period in the school's history. In terms of why the records were created, well, they document requests to remove, or more specifically ban, books from public school. So we'll want to look at what are the functions of the school library. And a school library, it serves as a critical educational resource and service for staff and students' academic experience. It plays a crucial role in preparing students for informed living in an information-rich society. The library program provides learning opportunities that enable students to become effective users of information and encourages students to examine the authority and bias of authors, to assess the importance of information to a particular topic, to determine the relevance of information to meet their needs, and to create and share new ideas. So in short, the library serves as a venue for personalized learning, curiosity, and interest. So we would then need to consider how the materials being appraised here reflect those core functions. In terms of what information is contained in the records, well, this series includes the evaluations by staff of complaints submitted by patrons or perhaps parents, as well as the record of any final decision. The contents reflect educational priorities and community cultural perspectives. They document decisions to retain or remove books from student access. We might want to further explore whether these requests are about 1 or 2 titles, or do they span many different titles. Do these reflect any precedent-setting decisions? And we want to ask whether this series is the only place this information exists. If so, it's more likely to be significant. Or are these types of decisions actually made by the school board? So is this series the best source of information? If they duplicate records of the school board, then you should only keep one version. But if they add to the information in the school board's files, for example, then they may be significant. For example, are there instances of protests that never make it to the school board? Perhaps library staff resolved disputes before they could get there. So keeping these records might complement the minutes of the school board and thus provide a more complete picture of the issue. Do the series dispute information found in the board minutes? For example, if the school board's records indicate very few complaints about books, but the library's own files indicate a large number of such complaints resolved without intervention of the board, then the library's perspective on the issue may be meaningful. And in considering whether this series is a unique source of information, we want to consider exactly the titles that might be involved. For instance, if they contain a few complaints about, say, the adventures of Huckleberry Finn or Catcher in the Rye, then they duplicate the files of thousands of school libraries in New York State and elsewhere, since these novels have been the subject of controversy since they were first published, which predate the time period of these records. If, however, the files contain a request to remove a more obscure title or a title that other schools have not dealt with or relate to when a particular book was published, then you might have a more unique instance of attempted censorship. For example, there were some cases to ban Harry Potter books in the 1990s and early 2000s. And finally, in terms of who is creating the records, well, that's library staff based on public requests. We might want to explore who else might be involved with these requests throughout their active process, such as the principal or the superintendent or the school board, because their records may also reflect these topics or these processes. And hopefully this example illustrates how we can apply the basic appraisal questions to a specific scenario. To appraise records to see if they have significant historical information, you want to collect background information about the history of your government and community. Appraisal can be a subjective process. The more you know about your government and the history of your area, the easier it will be to make a good decision. This helps place records within the larger context of use, function, and purpose. And you don't have to appraise alone. In fact, good appraisal decisions should never be left to a single individual. You can get help informally or even formally from your municipal historian, a records advisory committee, or other people who are familiar with your government and the community it serves. In the life of any government and community, certain periods of time are especially important to its development. You will want to identify these, which generally correspond to a widespread effect on the community and broad impact across several government departments, but it will vary. Some examples would include years during which the government was being established or periods of rapid change. Single events that might affect the community include disasters or division of neighborhoods, or particular development projects, or the closure or establishment of major industry. You will also want to assess the various functions of government, identifying information about how a department or a set of departments operate, which can be useful as it helps the appraiser understand the office that created the records. What were the functions and the activities? What was the historical development of an office, such as when it was created or any changes in its duties or jurisdiction? And who were the chief administrators or key players, or any special events that might have influenced its operation? Let's look at a hypothetical case study. Let's call it the town of Big Thunder. In trying to understand the local context of this town, we conduct our general research and learn there are some significant dates in its history and Development. It was founded in 1826. It was later made the county seat, and it expanded, creating new departments. In the late 30s, there was this controversy about the construction of an airport in which the planning commissioner resigned. The town mobilized for World War II in the early 40s to 1945. But after the war in 1956, the airport sank into the swamp, and in 1965, the town experienced devastating floods. And finally, in 1976, the town celebrated its 150th anniversary along with the U.S. bicentennial. Now, keep these dates in mind as we explore a functional analysis of the town's planning department. The mission of the Department of Planning is to develop and implement policies and programs to promote the orderly development of the town. The department's work focuses on zoning, infrastructure such as utilities and transportation, as well as housing, parks, natural resources, and environmental issues. As part of our appraisal research, we uncover some important dates regarding the planning department. It was established in 1928, and a professional engineer was appointed as its first commissioner, who served for a significant chunk of time. The town board gave the new commissioner widespread powers over zoning matters, construction, and other development issues. Now, the first commissioner, we'll call him Lewis Everett. He served as the chief engineer on the project to select an airport site, but he resigns in 1940 after a year of publicly ridiculing the town board on its choice of a site for the airport. We learned that during World War II, the town mobilizes its resources, including rationing, civil defense, and first aid, and the airport is an important regional hub for the war effort. Later on, in 1956, the third commissioner resigns after being accused of taking bribes from developers, and upon leaving office, he destroys files he created during his tenure. That's also the same year the airport sinks into the swamp due to its poor siting. Following the devastating floods in 1964, the commissioner for planning is responsible for developing the town's master plan in 1966 and building a civic center in 1970 on the site of the former World War II era factories. Unfortunately, 5 years later, the roof of the Civic Center collapses and the contractor is found liable for faulty construction. And then in 1976, as the town is celebrating its 150th anniversary, it unveils a new master plan. So hopefully these two slides are a good example which demonstrate how the development of a community and the evolution of a specific government function can influence the possible historical value of records. And once you have asked all the necessary questions, you will review all your answers because you don't want to make your decision based solely on one aspect of the materials. You want to assess all the factors and then make your decision to keep or discard or maybe even sample the records if appropriate. And then you'll document the decision, including what reasons you based your decision on. You should be able to demonstrate your analysis and justify your decisions. This can be a narrative memo that explores the context and content of the materials and lays out the answers to your questions. Or you can also use a checklist or a worksheet to help document your decision. You should also reflect appraisal decisions in any office retention schedules if you use those. It is important to document your decisions so that you don't have to appraise the same records over and over. It also serves as important evidence to future researchers and others as to why certain records exist and why others might not exist. Turning back to Big Thunder's planning department, here's one possible method of documenting an appraisal decision. Just keep in mind, it should be stressed that this sample is a very abbreviated example, but it contains the general elements that you should or could include in your appraisal documentation. It lists the series name, the date span, and the overall volume. So in 2020, during an inactive inventory project, the town discovers 12 boxes, 12 cubic feet of records at a Department of Public Works building in a mostly unused storage closet. A survey of these records reveals they consist of airport usage records dating to 1942 to 1946. The contents consist of reports, statistical summaries, memos, correspondence, flight details, etc. After careful analysis, it is decided that these records are archival and should be retained even though the retention period is only 6 years. These correspond to local government schedule item 1065. The appraisal memo or report details the reasons why. In this case, the Big Thunder Airport, it was a controversial public works project during the New Deal era. It served as an important hub transporting materials and supplies during the war. And the documentation of its usage during this time serves as important evidence of New York State war efforts and the town's contributions to those efforts on the home front. Hopefully this example ties in how our appraisal analysis can come together. To conclude, I'd like to share a few words of wisdom from folks who have written about archival appraisal. Richard Cox wrote that when even garbage provides important clues to the past, does it matter whether archivists have done much more than randomly acquire interesting documentary debris? It is important to ensure through appraisal that we're not simply acquiring interesting debris or worse yet, garbage. Our analysis should be clear and it should demonstrate why materials provide essential evidence of significant government functions and their effect on local communities. Mark Green wrote, "We will never make appraisal simple because we can never make it mechanically exact or scientific. Appraisal is not easy and it shouldn't be. It represents the hard decisions as to what will be reflected in the historical record and represents significant power in the formation of community memory." And finally, Leonard Rapport asserted that there are no perfect appraisals and the best appraisal is the one that does the least harm. It is always important to keep in mind what is gained and what is lost when records are appraised. We can't keep everything, but we also need to ensure the essential evidence of the human experience is preserved and accessible. Good luck appraising. Please contact us if at any time you have questions or would like assistance. Staff at the State Archives are here to support your records management and archival efforts. And with that, thank you for listening.